Welcome to today's deep dive, where we're going to explore the pretty fascinating connection between politics and food.
Yeah, it's something that people don't really often think about. I mean, you might be thinking, what does politics have to do with what I eat?
Right.
But it's really surprising how much influence governments actually have on our food and what ends up on our tables.
Exactly. And we've got some excerpts here from a research paper called The Political Factors Affecting a Nation's Staple Foods. And it really digs deep into this whole connection.
Yeah.
So we'll be using Indonesia's 4C-5 Sempurna program as like a case study.
Oh, that's a good one.
To kind of illustrate some of these concepts.
Yeah, that's a great example because it really highlights how these political agendas can be reflected in food policy sometimes.
Okay, so let's unpack these factors one by one.
Okay.
One of the most obvious ways politics impacts food, I think, is through those healthy eating campaigns that we see.
Yeah, like think about the food pyramid, right?
Right.
That you might have seen in school or something like that. Governments use tools like this to kind of nudge citizens towards what they consider to be healthy eating.
Right.
But have you ever really stopped to think about how those decisions are actually made?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
There's a lot happening behind the scenes, right?
Yeah, a lot of backroom deals.
Governments might subsidize certain food industries, or they launch those big public education campaigns to encourage people to eat specific foods.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they'll even tax or regulate foods that they consider unhealthy.
Right. And it's, those actions, they're often, I think, well-intentioned.
Right.
But you have to think about the unintended consequences.
Oh, totally, yeah.
Like subsidies can distort market prices, making certain foods artificially cheaper.
Yeah.
And that can lead to overconsumption of those things.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
One political decision ripples through the entire food system.
Exactly. And another thing to consider is food security.
Right.
Governments have a responsibility to make sure that everyone has enough to eat.
Especially during a crisis.
Especially during times of crisis. Exactly. So one strategy is to encourage domestic food production.
Okay.
To kind of reduce that reliance on imports.
So how does that play out in terms of policy?
Well, they could provide subsidies to farmers, right?
Okay.
Or invest in that agricultural infrastructure.
Okay.
So by kind of bolstering that local production, they aim to safeguard their food supply from global disruptions or political instability.
That makes sense. So it's not just about growing food, it's also about planning for any potential challenges.
Exactly. Strategic planning.
Okay.
And this kind of brings us to another interesting point, which is national security, believe it or not.
Okay.
Food choices can be tied to concerns about international relations.
This is where it gets really interesting. I never thought about food as a national security issue.
Well, a nation's food security is directly linked to its vulnerability. So imagine a country that relies on imports for a key staple food, right?
Yeah.
If relations with that supplier were to deteriorate, they could suddenly face food shortages. So you see how those things are connected.
Yeah, that's a powerful point. So governments might promote certain foods or farming practices, not just for health or economic reasons, but to enhance their strategic autonomy.
Absolutely. And then there's the concept of using food to foster a sense of national pride.
Okay.
Governments often promote specific foods as part of their cultural identity. It's almost like edible flags.
Okay, I love that analogy, edible flags. So give us an example.
Okay, well, think about Japan and sushi,
Right.
Or Italy and pasta.
Mm-hmm.
These dishes have become so iconic that they're practically synonymous with those countries.
Yeah.
So by celebrating those foods, they tap into a sense of shared heritage and tradition.
It's like food becomes this symbol of national unity.
Exactly, and it goes beyond just dishes.
Okay.
Think about maple syrup in Canada,
Right.
Or kimchi in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
These ingredients carry strong cultural connotations, and governments often use them to promote national identity.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah.
It shows how food can be more than just sustenance. It's like this powerful tool for shaping narratives.
Exactly. And all of these factors, they often intertwine.
Yeah.
A government might promote a locally sourced ingredient for health reasons and to bolster national pride at the same time.
So it's like this complex web of motivations that are all playing out on our place.
Exactly. And we're just scratching the surface here.
Yeah.
There's so much more to explore. But before we dive deeper, I think we should take a closer look at the Indonesian EP05 Semperna program.
Okay.
Because that'll illustrate how some of these factors played out in a real-world context.
Great idea. Let's do that.
So the 4CHAP5 Semperna program was launched in Indonesia back in the 1950s.
Okay.
It was a time when the nation was newly independent and really focused on building a strong national identity.
So the program came out of this really specific historical and political context.
Precisely. And the program itself, which translates to 4 Healthy, 5 Perfect, promoted a balanced diet based on these specific food groups.
It sounds like the government was really trying to instill certain values and habits.
Yeah, the program really reflects this desire for order and progress.
Okay.
It emphasized this structured approach to nutrition with these clear guidelines on what makes a healthy meal, and this really aligned with the government's efforts to modernize the nation and improve public health.
It's interesting how something as simple as a food program can be tied to these big national goals.
Oh, absolutely. And it wasn't just about individual health either.
Right.
It was presented as a way to contribute to national strength and prosperity.
Yep.
So the thinking was a healthy population would be more productive and resilient.
So there's a connection to food security and national security that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. By promoting a balanced diet and encouraging domestic food production, the program aimed to strengthen the nation both internally and externally.
Okay, so we've seen how this program tied into national identity and security.
Right.
But what about the economic side of things? How did trade policies and taxes factor in?
Yeah, that's a really crucial point. Trade deals and taxes can have a huge impact on what foods are available and how affordable they are.
Right.
Governments might use tariffs to protect domestic industries, or they might negotiate trade agreements to secure access to certain foods.
So these international agreements can really shape what we see in our supermarkets and kitchens.
Oh, they certainly can. For example, a trade deal that lowers tariffs on imported fruits might lead to a wider variety and lower prices for consumers.
Right.
But on the other hand, it could also hurt domestic fruit producers who now face more competition.
It's like this balancing act between competing interests.
Exactly. And governments have to really weigh these factors carefully when they're making decisions about trade and food policy. In the case of Indonesia's 4CHAP5 Semperna program, the government also sought to promote self-sufficiency.
Okay.
By encouraging people to consume locally produced foods.
Because there's that connection again to nationalism and reducing reliance on imports.
Precisely, the program really fit into this broader narrative of national pride and independence. You know, it encouraged Indonesians to embrace their own culinary traditions and support their local farmers.
It's amazing how a seemingly simple dietary guideline can be connected to so many layers of political and economic considerations.
It really highlights the complexity of food systems and how they're intertwined with politics and society.
Speaking of complexity, we've talked a lot about how governments influence food choices.
Right.
But what about the role of corporations? Do they have any say in this?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that deserves a lot more attention. Food and agriculture are massive industries, and they have a lot of influence on government policy.
So how does that influence play out?
Well, corporations can lobby governments to enact policies that benefit their bottom line.
Okay.
So, for example, they might push for subsidies for certain crops, or they might lobby for relaxed regulations on food additives.
So it's not just governments shaping food choices. Corporations are vying for a seat at the table, too.
Absolutely. And this raises some really important questions about transparency and accountability.
Right.
Consumers need to be aware of how corporate influence might be shaping the food that they're eating.
It's like another layer of complexity in this already intricate system.
Exactly. And it's really crucial for us to understand these dynamics if we want to make informed choices about the food we consume and the policies that govern our food systems.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
We've seen how politics influences food choices through health campaigns, trade deals, national security concerns, even corporate lobbying. And we've explored how Indonesia's 4CHAP5 Semperna program reflected the political and social context of its time.
Right.
But we're not done yet.
No, we're not.
There's another really crucial aspect that we need to address.
Yes.
And that's the ethical considerations of government intervention in food choices.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's not just about practicality and economics. You know,
Right.
there are moral dimensions to think about as well.
Yeah, when governments start influencing what people eat, it really raises these ethical questions.
Yeah.
Where do we draw the line between encouraging healthy choices
Right.
and actually restricting individual freedom?
It's a tough one, it's this balancing act.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, governments do have that responsibility to protect public health.
Right.
So they might implement policies to address things like obesity
Right.
or malnutrition, and that can involve regulating food advertising, taxing sugary drinks, or even banning certain ingredients altogether.
Wow, yeah, those are pretty drastic measures. Makes you wonder if they're going too far sometimes.
Yeah, it's definitely a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Critics will argue that excessive government intervention can lead to, a nanny state, where people are treated like children and can't make their own decisions.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. People should have the right to choose what they eat, even if it's not the healthiest choice.
I agree with that, but then there's that counter argument, that people don't always act in their own best interest.
Yeah.
Especially when they're faced with all this complex information or aggressive marketing tactics,
Right.
Right. So some argue that government intervention is necessary to level the playing field and protect the most vulnerable people.
It's a tough dilemma.
Yeah.
How do we balance individual autonomy with the need to address public health?
It's a big question,
Yeah.
It's something that societies have been grappling with for centuries.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer, and the right approach really depends on the context.
Yeah.
But it's crucial that we keep having these open and honest conversations about the ethical considerations.
Right.
So that we can, make the best choices.
Okay, so looking back at Indonesia's 4-CHAT5 Sempurna program, what lessons can we learn from it?
Well, it's a really fascinating case study in how these political agendas, social values, and nutritional science can all come together.
Right.
I mean, it was groundbreaking for its time.
Yeah.
It promoted this balanced diet when nutritional knowledge was still really limited. But it did eventually face criticism, for being overly simplistic and not keeping pace with the evolving science.
Yeah, so what was considered healthy back then
Yeah.
might not align with what we know today.
Exactly. Our understanding of nutrition is constantly evolving.
Right.
It's interesting, though, that even though 4-CHAT5 Sempurna might not align with current dietary guidelines, it still holds a place in the collective memory of a lot of Indonesians.
It's like this reminder that food policies can really have a lasting impact on culture and behavior,
Absolutely.
even after they've been revised.
And it highlights how important it is to be critical of food policies, to constantly evaluate their effectiveness and be ready to adapt to new information.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We've explored all these different ways that politics shapes our food choices, from healthy eating campaigns to national security and even national pride.
Yeah.
We delved into trade deals, corporate influence, and even the ethics of government intervention.
It's complicated.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
And we've learned some valuable lessons from the 4-CHAT5 Sempurna program. Food policy is never just about food.
Right.
It reflects a nation's priorities, values, and aspirations.
Exactly.
So next time you sit down for a meal,
Yeah.
really think about the journey your food took to get to your plate. Think about the farmers who grew it, the policies that shaped its production,
Yeah.
and the cultural values that it represents.
And remember that every bite is kind of like a vote
Wow.
for a particular food system. So by understanding the political factors that shape our food choices, we can become more informed consumers
Yes.
and advocate for a more just and sustainable food future.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of food politics.